my goodness, I'm so excited to start up our Stories from the Field episodes again. It's been a while. Um, Last year was quite a year to say the least. And so I'm very pleased to start this new series with some dear friends and really kind of lean into a slightly new direction. There's a lot of conversations that I've been having online and on LinkedIn around the Gestalt practice that I'm currently a part of. And I thought, what better way to introduce you all to this idea of holism and integration and becoming than with these two incredible human beings. And so today's conversation is really about what it's like to make contact. And even saying that out loud, I'm sure a lot of people are like, what are you talking about? What does that mean? So I thought maybe first we could start with some introductions and maybe just my intention, to set my intention for this conversation. For me, really, it was about how do we stay in contact with ourselves and with each other in these very uncertain moments. And I think sometimes that becomes really, really hard. I know that's a conversation we have with leaders all the time, across the board with all three of us. And so that was my inspiration for this topic. And with that said, I'd love to just ask you to jump in and introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about you. So maybe, I don't know, who wants to jump in?
Go ahead, Nnaceesay.
Go for it, Tsheli. I was going to volunteer you.
Okay, so my name is Tsheli Lujabe. I'm originally from South Africa. I have a background as a clinical psychologist and which informs my work. However, I've been working for the last 20 plus years as a leadership and organizational development consultant. And have been really interested in Gestalt methodology for exactly the reason that Oana just mentioned, which is that sense of holism, but being able to look at not who you are in fragments and showing up as the confident me or showing up as the professional me, but being able to show up as all these different sides. And what does that mean for how I have contact with myself? And we'll be talking a little bit more about that just now. And contact in relationship with others. So part of my practice is being relational, and I'm based in the UK and work in lots of different countries across the world. Yeah, that's
Thank
probably
you,
in
Tsheli,
short
and
about me.
thank you, Tsheli and Oana. Thank you, Oana, for the reminder to get in touch with ourselves. It reminds me a little bit of the activity we did at Gestalt iGold, which was the first one around who are you. So just really thinking about that, I think in essence, I've been a seeker like for most of my life. So I spent the first 10 wondering, how do people get jobs? And like, how do you put people who are really suited for this work into this work? How do you form relationships? How do you maintain relationships with candidates long term? So I think really like long-term relationships has formed the foundation of the work that I've done. So I did that for the first 10 years of my career. And then for the next almost decade, I worked with how do human beings think? How do we develop? Like what influences our development? What role does the environment have? So I was a mom at that point, and I got interested in the development of my son and working within Montessori. I ended up starting a school and doing training and making contact, actually, a lot of contact then. And I moved back to the UK, and I'm again seeking what I want to do with the next few years of my life. And I went back to executive search. And quite interestingly, right now I'm more interested in working with people who are interested in buying businesses that have been uh, that don't have a succession plan per se, but are baby boomer businesses. So that's the kind of people that I'm interested in searching with now. Yeah, it's a long
Yeah,
introduction.
yeah, I think it like helps us get settled into the Gestalt setup versus our usual leadership show up. And what you said actually reminded me about like the full circle I feel like I've had since our Cape Town experience, where the whole reason I was so interested in Gestalt was around resistance. And if we think about the conversation with contact, and you think of, you know, my entire career was about helping leaders and organizations navigate difference. And initially it was like cross-cultural competence, unconscious bias, then anti-racism, and now it's like back to what I call DI light. Um, but it's still hard. And I think I recognized earlier in my career, and especially when we were doing like anti-racism programming, that I felt underskilled in how I noticed and the meaning making I was making with resistance. And the empathy in me was like, oh, this is a really hard conversation. But like the facilitator in me is like, let's move on. um, you know, we have this agenda, we have this many minutes left, right? And now it just makes me think of, I feel so much more upskilled to have to meet people where they are. And I think
Mm.
that's part of what contact means for me is understanding how contact works. And we'll maybe get into that in the conversation of like, what does it even mean? But also, you know, how if we think about the people that are listening to this, they want to know, we get access to you and they get access to you via us, right? And we have these incredible experiences in the people that we touch in our work. And I'm wondering if maybe, and I could share a story for myself, and then maybe we can get into this need for contact and why it matters. But um, a while ago, I feel like maybe it's been 4 years now, we scaled this huge project with this company called Peloton that many people are familiar with. This was during COVID days. And part of the scaling is we were leading these conversations with leaders. And part of the conversation, you know, as many organizations had signed up for these commitments to anti-racism. And so we were leading sessions and we did it virtually. So it was like a 4-part series, and module 1 was like, you know, forming, norming, storming, et cetera, right? And I'll never forget that, like every time I got to the part of the module, we called it White Supremacy Week, because we were introducing the concepts of the dominant culture paradigm and the deep conversations around how actually we do this across cultures, across borders, across what people look like. So you know, the key power characteristics is really like a more accurate way to talk about some of these things, and how I would just like get myself ready for that week, you know. And it was really, really hard. And I think about what making contact for me meant at that time and what it means for me now. And for me at that time, it was like putting my armor on,
Mm.
because we have a pair facilitation model where it would never be Felicia or Jason that would do that section. It was always me.
Mhm.
And so I had to show up with, this is how I do these things. These are how these characteristics showed up in my success, in my style, in how I was rewarded in corporate professional culture. And and I would have, you know, all types of reactions, from deflection, like, what does this mean? I don't understand, to
Mm.
outright, like, I don't agree, you know? So, so making contact there, I felt like I showed up as the one of the persuader.
Mm.
Let me show up with all the
Mm.
data. Let me show up with all the story. And, you know, it's finesse, with stories, with, you know, the packaging. Whereas now and I'm feeling it in my body and in my hairs are standing on my head. I show up as trying to, like, the invitation of understanding what it's touching.
Mm.
Mm.
And I think that's really, really powerful in the gift of the program that we're in. Um, and so maybe I'll stop there and ask if maybe you all are willing to share a story or think of just like that real moment. And it could be work, and we can get into personal. I think personal is harder, so that's why I'm starting with work because personal is very vulnerable. But is there a version of that for you?
I think there certainly is a version of that for me, and I think it's the example I have is, working with really senior leaders in organizations, and there's times where it's about them getting in contact with their authentic selves, and needing to inquire into what has shaped them to be the leaders that they are today, and then who are they, and to tell that story in lots of different ways. So sometimes in the way of creating a lifeline, and then being able to actually share that with a group of colleagues that they may never have shared certain things with, and what are the choices they make about what they share and what they don't share, or doing it in the form of a shield and maybe using drawings, which can be quite uncomfortable for people. And I think at a certain point, I used to feel quite anxious. And so, in my own anxiety, had, if we talk about resistance, had this should in my ear, where I was like, well, I should be less anxious. I should be less anxious, which would only make me more anxious and therefore not be in proper contact with myself. And then I would start to over explain what it was I was trying to do, which would then make me in less contact with them. And then probably, a domino effect of them being in less contact with themselves. What I've found over time and more recently is, as I get more comfortable with who I am as a practitioner, and more comfortable with emergence, I might put it that way, is in those situations doing less of the should, and slowing myself down to also be able to be vulnerable with myself, because I think a part of me was also afraid to share some of those aspects, and afraid about what it means to be open and how open you can be. And I think as I become more in contact with myself around that, it allows me, when I'm facilitating those type of sessions, to relax and therefore see what happens, and not over explain, and just say, this is what it is, let's give it a go. And that I think that creates a much more permeable boundary, rather than the professional self coming to the fore. So that's an example that I and it just creates a sense of richness in terms of what people are actually able to share with each other.
And it almost sounds like less facilitator, right? And more intervener,
Mm-hmm.
um, which
Yes,
is hard sometimes when you've been the facilitator more, or that's what your role is for that client. That's what they see you as.
absolutely. And it's also um, there's another tricky aspect when, because I think how one is or shows up as a facilitator is also about the relationship with who you're working with,
Mm.
and how how you are in contact with who you are working with. I think also makes a difference in terms of what happens with the people that you're facilitating.
Nasi, do you want to jump in? I'm going to try to be
Yeah,
less facilitator, but
Make it
I'm
more of a
sort of
conversation.
oscillating between personal and I guess they're all interlinked. So I'll just say, like when we were quite young, we lived in my grandmother's house. So we lived downstairs in my grandmother's house with my mom and dad. And my grandmother lived upstairs, and my uncle was a parliamentarian. And then every election cycle, there'd be like floods of people in there. And elections are really interesting in Africa because, there's a lot of like conversations that go on around them. And I just watched my grandmother making contact with different people and the different stories they had in support of her son. And I think back to my work of Montessori and just having one life experience of being a Gambian woman, and then, through the application forms, we actually try to ask people a lot of questions about being. Like, tell us about a time when, you felt ashamed. Tell us about a time that you felt you'd done something that really moved you. What is your purpose? And having these multitude of like realities really shifted how I saw contact and really shifted like the mission of the work that I wanted to do. Because I think as a leader, you can sometimes have a one-track mind that you go and say, I'm going to do Montessori in these communities, but you don't really have an understanding as much as you do. And I think as much as you think you do. And I think like really connecting and listening to people under a shared purpose. And I wonder if like the shared purpose also facilitated that ability to like listen and really learn from people, I remember one of my fellows would always say, Nasia, you wouldn't understand. And I'd be like, but try me, And then when he'd say, I was like, actually, I do understand a little bit of that. And I think when we make contact, there's always that we'll find a piece of ourselves in the conversations that we'll have. It's an opening to like become more
Mm.
human. So for me, yeah. So I think it was really observing my grandmother and how she made contact. And it was in a very also like power driven way that my grandmother sometimes made contact. And then seeing that, trying that out, and then think, oh, no, actually, this doesn't really work for me. The times are a lot more different as well. And thinking about how I would like to make contact. Yeah. So I think that's part of what
Mm.
I'd like to say. Yeah.
it's interesting in your example, and for the sake of people that are listening, it's like contact is engagement, contact is discovery, contact is listening. What else would you add if we were to break it down?
I would say contact is about change as well. So, like changing yourself, but also through it, changing the other person. It doesn't have to be like this huge change, but even just the smallest shift, which could just be an insight. I actually think it happened to me now. Listening to your story, Nasi, of your grandmother, just created like a shift. I noticed my energy shifting, and I noticed just even emotionally something happening for me, and me starting to to think of, you know, similar moments, but there was just something, an insight that I had just from what you said, and I think part of that is contact,
Yeah.
getting that insight as well.
Like contact is flow, like the
Mm-hmm.
vibe, right? Actually, it makes me think of Nasi when we had our last catch up on WhatsApp. And I said something like, I didn't even know I needed this, but I'm so glad that we connected.
Mm.
And it really does feel like that tall glass of cold water when you didn't know you were thirsty, right? So if I were um, very visual, obviously, and I like symbolism, but I think it's also contact is, or how you feel when making contact is a really good antenna or like indicator of if you're noticing enough, if you're practicing to notice, like how did that feel making contact, right?
Yeah. The visuals always work for me. And I love what you said, Tilly, about being changed. I couldn't remember the quote, but it's something around like being willing to be changed by the conversation. And with what you said, there's this concept of satisfactory contact also in Gestalt, that actually that we make this effort to be in relationship and like, is it like how can we make that contact satisfactory, which is also a bit of a skill. And what gets in the way when that's not there? What gets in the way of me? What gets in the way of each other? Yeah, so I think maybe that's what I'll add. Necessary, willing to be changed, like Billy said, and not satisfactory contact, like you
Mm.
said.
And I think sometimes, um, you know, what you said about the willingness to be changed is, I notice sometimes, and actually it happened in the last couple of days, is I was working with a client, and there was one of the participants who was really inquisitive. So if I frame it, was really inquisitive, spoke a lot, um, and I then started to have the thing in my mind of, oh, this person's not listening actually. He's not listening to other people. And and I think others were also having an experience of him not listening. And then started to withdraw. So I think with the withdrawal, and then I noticed myself um, not withdrawing, but maybe being a little bit judgmental, of not listening. And I really had to slow myself down, do a bit of reflection about what was actually happening here in the relating that was making there not to be contact. And how could I now regain contact? um, and it was really quite helpful because we did like a kind of coaching demo, and he volunteered, and so I actually had to coach him, and through that exercise had to really be present with him. And um, I had to listen to him. And so in that, actually then made contact, so but it really, and then got to the satisfactory contact that you're talking about, see. And I think also, as he told his story in that kind of coaching moment, it allowed the others also, as they listened to this conversation, to maybe see him in a different way and also make contact with him. But it really took a process of all of us possibly slowing down. And I think I think that's also part of contact, is the engaging, the connecting, but it's also the reflecting.
Mm.
Um, that helps with that.
It makes me think of, the coaching book, The Fertile Void. I can't remember what the name of the author is, but we are
Mm.
all at some point reading it. And he gave this example of like he was coaching someone and found himself really bored and like wandering off. And so what your story reminds me is that like how we feel is a part of a whole.
Mm.
So if I'm feeling this way, there's actual value to saying like, hey, and I think that's what he did in
Mm.
the example, like, hey, I'm finding myself really bored. Like, sounds like you need, like, tell me something real. He was coaching
Mhm.
someone. It's like, this is boring. Tell me something real. Like and so I think that's a really great example of like use of self also, right? It's like, if I'm feeling this way, right, how do I use that as data
Yeah.
to make contact in a different way?
And actually, as you say, tell me something real. The thing that I said was, can you say something specific?
Mm.
Mm.
Was talking in the general,
Mm.
and just saying, can you give me a specific example?
Mm.
That was the thing that actually helped. Rather than me thinking, oh, talking a lot, then I could think, oh, actually, it's actually the general I'm finding that I'm struggling with.
Mm.
Please say something specific, which then helped. Yeah.
What do you think is like the cost of not showing up that way? For example, like I think about our program and how I continue to like challenge myself to show up while also protecting, because there is plenty to navigate in between the two polarities. And I think about, and we all have our own definition of what showing up means, right? But I'm wondering, like, what do you think? Maybe even in that example or the example that you've shared, Nasi, why? Like, why bother? And other than like, of course, satisfaction and like growth and all this stuff, but like on a practical level, oftentimes we're protecting ourselves for a reason, or we're scared or anxious for a reason, and that's really hard to not see or not feel, right?
Yeah, I mean, in line with that, I think what Tiri said about the inner dialogue that goes on in your head before you even make contact, like even being aware of that and thinking of and testing that out. Is that real? Is that a projection? Am I just desensitizing? Does this look like a situation that I've come to before? I think testing that out for yourself like gives you a better understanding of yourself and also a better understanding of your gut instinct. Is this actually right or not? And I think it gives you a choice also. So you can choose how to make contact. So making contact is not just in one way, but you can choose, okay, how do I approach this? Because self-protection is also important if there's a real risk. But if we have this armor or self-protection around us all the time, then we sort of miss out on these opportunities that humans do need to survive. Like we need to belong to a group, we need to survive, we need to make contact and connection. And there's an impact for that in terms of our well-being. There's an impact for that in terms of, I think every aspect of our life. So I think making contact, even if it's unsatisfactory, is data. It teaches you something about yourself and teaches you maybe something about the other person. But I think more importantly about yourself and like, why did it rub me in this way? Like, which part of my ego is feeling bruised? Or did I not listen to myself going in? Should I have known better? Yeah. So I think there's always data from contact and like, staying away from making that contact, you don't deepen your knowledge of yourself. And then therefore you limit the choices that you have. But yeah, it's,
Mm.
sometimes, I maybe an example for me is just I make contact in a different way. I noticed when we were in Cape Town the first time, I noticed that about myself. I can't make like short standing contact. I'll always be like, okay, I'll see you later. If we're not sitting and having a 30-minute conversation, I'm not invested. So, and I noticed that this is something that happens at the school gate as well. It's not a 30-minute sit down conversation. Therefore, like, I'm checking out, unless we can have coffee at another time. But what does that say for my relationship? So just being upfront with that to people and say, look, I'd really like to connect, but maybe over coffee for 30 minutes. Yeah. What are
You're
you
not like a
thinking?
ships in the night person, right? No in between doors.
No. You know that one.
I know, I know. You know what's funny though, like as you even describe like the data and what it tells us about us, it's also like I think about like you could totally misfire about what you think is happening if you don't
Mm,
pay attention to contact. Like if I showed up with my fear and thinking about it's like confirmation bias, right? You get this one little
mhm,
nugget and that little you start running with it, right? And people like
mhm.
me, I'm like wildfire. I have all these ideas then and I like run with it,
You're not
and it
alone.
and yeah. And it's interesting because as like all the research shares, we stop listening to all the other stuff. And I think that's
Mm,
the other piece. You misfire, and we lead. We create the containers and we manage the containers and the energies, right? And then you're like taking it in a direction the system doesn't need or want
mm,
because of something that's sticky to us. So I think that's another really powerful piece, especially like for us when we do like train the trainers and like, do you know your stuff? Do you know your
mm,
triggers? Do you know why? Because it is really hard conversation sometimes,
mm,
and
Mm.
there are many cautionary tales that I could share that I won't. Um, but I that is very curious to me, and what we miss out is like an actual impact, I think.
mm.
Mm.
My
Mm.
ego may feel good. I may get on a soapbox and tell you all the things and all the ways, but that's not like impact, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the impact is important. I also think this idea of choice
Mm.
is so, when you said it, Nasi, it just became figural for me around, you know, what are the it matters because what are the choices that we make? And sometimes I think we can get into a state, especially if what I'm overwhelmed,
Mm,
then I think I don't have choice.
mhm,
And the only way is, I don't know, just to be embroiled in the chaos or confusion or
mm,
or just going fast. And yet in that moment there might actually be multiple choices. And at that kind of contact boundary with myself is being able to say, okay, so what are your choices in the moment?
mm.
You know, um, even then, like for yourself, Nasi, at the school gate, is, what choice do you, what's the choice? Is it that you say, hey, let's have the 30-minute conversation, or at that moment say, okay, maybe this is all we are able to do now, but I would really like to take it further, or not, you know. So, but even just being able to see those options. So I
Mm,
see this idea of choice as being something that's really important.
mhm,
Is there now see with your example, because I like that. I mean, I feel it's super helpful. Just like if you would have told me that, I would know. Then
mhm,
I'm not offended. then I'm going to send you a Calendly with a coffee date, right? I'm wondering, if there's like a small practice based on like what we've all learned through this practice. Like, is there something that you feel you're putting in place to improve the quality of the way you make contact, or maybe the way you communicate about the way you make contact?
I think self-awareness, just awareness that actually it's not that there's not possibilities for successful contact. It's just that the way that I make contact based on my, I'd say maybe cultural is a bit of a emphasis there. And I think it brings us to the context of like multicultural contact. So I think one thing that's interesting, and I don't know if you can talk about the program, but I'll just say iGold is that it is so multicultural. People are from different
Mm-hmm.
places, different work experiences, different backgrounds. And I think we all make contact differently. And as humans, we think, no, this is the way to make contact, you know? So I've just
Mm.
had to say, and obviously, parents who are Spanish totally get this, you know, parents who are African, they totally get this, you know? Because then it's like long coffees and long dinners. And then parents who don't come from that sort of multi are okay with a high and a bye. And today I did stay a little longer, so I stayed for an hour. But I think it's thinking about like what is the multicultural basis? What is my stuff and what is someone else's stuff? It's not that the person, like you can't get to a deep, satisfactory conversation with the person. It's just that maybe that space or that environment is not possible. And saying to the person, I'd really love to connect. So maybe let's do coffee at some point, and then actually making time for that coffee. But just the self-awareness, I actually realized in iGold. So I think self-awareness is probably the first thing. I think when we make contact, sometimes we're prone to saying, oh no, let's fix the other person. But then like realizing like what is it that's going on with us? Like what makes it difficult, what makes it challenging, you know, like what's going on in our own heads sort of
Mm.
supports that moving forward. Yeah.
Mm.
When
Yeah,
when we're awake. I mean, I'm not awake all the time, but when we're awake, yeah. Yeah.
I'd really agree with you with the self-awareness. And I think for me, what I would add is um, sometimes not only having the internal dialogue,
Hmm.
because I think for me, the learning around myself and understanding of self has
Mhm.
been um, through partially having the internal dialogue, but then also vocalizing some of that stuff in the way that we're
Mhm.
doing now. And I think through the vocalizing of it, I find that then I learn. So there's the self awareness, but then there's the how do I say it out loud?
Mm.
Not all of it, because maybe some of it does need to stay quiet. But, um, you know, in the sharing, then I'm learning something else. And I think that's that is it intercultural
Mhm.
piece where the cultures cross over and the cultures connect, because I think that's also what um, I find I'm learning on the program is, and I think in life in general is, as you connect with other people, there's points of, oh, okay, but my culture is like this as an individual, and maybe my wider, um,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
national cultural background, but also where are the points of interconnection?
think the points of friction are in the meaning making in those intercultural exchanges, right? So, like my expectations of someone, and then what that means when it doesn't happen, right? I think is very interesting. I'll share a quick story for me that I think is safe enough for a podcast. But in my old job, there was a new team member that joined, and we were having like a team dinner. We were in Chicago, and we were all sitting ordering our food, and I ordered my food, and then this new team member was like, "Oh, I'll just share with you." And I think you both know me enough by now. Like, don't invite yourself to my meal. like, no, you're not. Like, I ordered. I ordered what I was gonna eat. And I make this joke all the time because both my husband and I are former communist kids. And you just don't do that. Like, and then I remember at the team dinner, our boss at the time, they're like former Peace Corps people, and they're like, "Oh, but I lived in a communist country," and that became all about their experience. And I was like, you know what? Like, you've never experienced communism in Romania. You don't know what my childhood was like. You don't know, right?
Mhm.
But it was so simple, like uh, in its form, right? Like, it was food. But this is 10 years later. I'm still like, don't you dare invite yourself to my dinner. And again, like, if we had co-created the ordering together, I would have been fine, right? Saying it out loud. But no, you like it, and then became this big, like, I can't believe you don't like to share, you know? And so I say this because I think it's like the perfect example in a way, because one, it's very true to me, and you know me and my food
Yes.
needs and likes and wants. But also, it's like a really good example of what that point of friction is. And I think what's really, really hard with something like our program is that it is so visceral and raw and real sometimes, and you can't help but show up in your identity and in your fears and in what that means for me, and can I trust you with this story? Like, even how I feel now versus the start of our podcast, because it's such a different format than how we usually interact, it felt awkward and weird. And then we warmed up and we showed up and we made contact, right? And I think that's the part that I would love to figure out, like, how do we translate that to people that don't do this like we do?
Mm.
I think, I mean, there's a willingness aspect of it, this willingness to change, and change is painful. So every time you make contact with someone, there's going to be the pain of losing your old self and letting go of the beliefs that you have. And then, you know, being courageous enough to sort of like step into this new you that you didn't even know was there, you know. I can definitely relate to the program being raw. And I think the way it's stacked is that you help but show up as yourself. You know, I'm like, I'm going to sit in the corner and observe. And as soon as something goes off, I'm like jumping in there and like, no, 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 intervening with the
People like you.
And I can't even rein myself in. That's how much of myself I am. I can't rein myself in. And then when the momentum is down, I'm like, oh wow. I think in the first one I was kind of like, oh no, that's not me. And then afterwards it's like, oh, that is me. Like the second time around, that is definitely me. So yeah. So I think just becoming face to face with yourself is one of those things. You must be willing to let go of who you think you are to, you know, this ideal self that we all have to become
Mm.
this whole fuller self that you speak about. And I think this aspect of inscaping, because I think we spend so much energy thinking, what's Tilly thinking about? What's Tilly thinking about? You know, what's Nnaceesay thinking about this? Does she like my hair? Does she like my glasses? You know, and I think sometimes when, you know, we just inscape and say what we're thinking, it sort of like takes away the pressure. And I think that's something that, you know, like we do quite well. Like we'll be like, oh my goodness, like don't judge me, but like this and this and this and this. And we're okay with that. We know that we're more than this single way of presenting ourselves, and we leave with that or without that. But I think just having that space to be able to do that. We've all taken a risk to go on a program and become a triad, which is what we are. Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean,
I
that's
feel
a
like we
risk.
need to
That's it's
release
a
like a
risk.
glossary of terms after this one. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
being okay with being a triad, whilst also noticing the other configurations one finds oneself in, because I think
Yeah.
that's the thing, is that one shows up in multiple ways. So yes, we show up as a triad, and there's a multiplicity of other ways in which we show up. I don't know why this came to mind, but Wana, as you were talking, I was just thinking, you know, in fact, as you were both talking, I was just thinking there's also times where um like knowing who you are, or what you want and need in a moment, and being able to claim that and articulate it, and it being accepted by somebody else is also contact. And let me give an example, because I think it's that whilst we are a triad, there's times where, I'll say to you, Wana, do you wanna wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and go for a walk with me? Well, I run.
Denied.
And you're like, no, TD, no, that's not for me. I'm gonna sit this one in. I really want to just rest, and I want to sleep, and then feel revived. And I will arrive in the morning in the way that I want to arrive. And I'm able to be like, oh yeah, okay, because that's how you want to arrive. And whilst maybe I want to have rushed around the world for an hour in the morning, or well, run, and that's my way of slowing down, and then, or feeling grounded, and then it allows me to show up as me. But it, just the having the conversation, and then you expressing your need, I express my need, and then we can, that creates a meeting and creates contact. So yeah, I just noticed that. So even through our differences and learning our differences, we make contact and being open. I think it's back to your willingness thing, Nasi.
Sometimes we learn from our contrast, right? Like you don't even realize how much you really want to sleep in when you're not with your kids until your friends keep asking you to wake up at 5 in the morning for a walk, and you're like, no, right? Or you don't even realize how much you cherish like what you order until somebody tries to invite themselves into your meal, and you're like, no, right? Um, I want to make sure that we don't go too long. So I wanted, typically when we have guests on, we have two questions, and I'm going to ask you both if you could share. We love to do plugs for other people and their work and what they're interested in. So my first question is, what are you working on right now that you're really excited about? And then what's your parting request for whether it's inclusion champions or practitioners listening to you today? What's your call to action as we close out?
um One thing that I'm working on right now is actually a podcast. So going to start up a podcast, which is actually about voices of African leaders. So for me, I think that something that's really important to me, and I think it speaks to this idea of contact, is the idea of the spirit of Ubuntu, which I think is quite central to African leadership, which is I am a human being because you are, and it is through my humanity and the connection with your humanity that makes us human. But I think it's, for me, it's like, what's the, you know, what does African leadership look like in all its multiplicity, and what does it actually mean? And so I'd like to I'm wanting to inquire into that, and hear from, and when I talk about leaders, it's like people from all walks of life that are leading themselves and others, and the contexts that they find themselves in. So my one parting request is really for people to pay attention, and to be attentive to yourself, how you engage, how you connect, and that whilst reflection might feel like you're going too slow, it's actually, you need both reflection and engagement. You need protecting yourself as well as connecting with yourself and others in order to grow. And so that's my encouragement to people is, take the risk of making contact. It can be liberating.
I think my,
Yeah.
yeah, I was going to say, I think my takeaway is that it's worth the risk. Like who I've become, even if I think about the beginning of having the courage to start Firefly, and when I was told, what I could or couldn't be, or who I was or wasn't, I could never go back to being that version of me, and that took courage. And I would say that making contact sucks sometimes, um, and what you learn from who you are in those moments, I think, is really important, and I think the growth is worth it. So whether it's Gestalt for other people or something else, I think for practitioners that are trying to figure out where they go from here because of all the political and economic challenges, I think it really is about like your purpose and your gift to the world. And maybe right now it's packaged as this, but when you think about the stuff that really gives you energy, that's a really good place to start looking. So I would say have courage to become.
Lovely.
Thank you.
It has. It's been great, and I feel what you said at the end there, Wana, is lovely. Just I feel like we've been doing some becoming together.